Well, hello everyone. I am pleased to welcome Martha Tatarnic, Reverend Martha Tatarnic. She is the rector at St. George's in St. Catherine, St. George's Anglican Church. And we've connected before on our mutual love of writing, and we still have yet to be in the same place at the same time.
Yeah, I guess
So
we've never met in person, have we?
you've
But
never
we've been on each other's podcasts.
exactly. And Martha is here today to talk about her new book, where's my camera, which is Anne Boleyn, Reputation, Revolution, Religion, and the Queen Who Changed History. And you were kind to send me an advance copy so that I could read it. And I have to admit, I'm not a historian, like I'm not a history buff like you. But it was super accessible. It was super fascinating as somebody who doesn't kind of fit in that world. Um, I enjoyed learning more about Anne, this person that I didn't really know anything about, uh,
Yeah.
beyond just well, she was one of the wives and all that kind of stuff. And so, and you kind of dig into why that is, um, why we need to push beyond that kind of narrative into kind of the importance of who she was and who she is for our history. So let's just begin with kind of a basic question. Like for you, why Anne Boleyn? Why is she somebody that you have kind of narrowed in on? And why is she important to you?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I will get into that question by way of saying I'm really grateful to you for saying that you're not like naturally a history buff, because I would say that is exactly um, you know, what I had in mind when I was reading the book. Like, I enjoy reading an 800 page book about all of the nitty gritty details about Anne Boleyn and what we know about her and what we don't, and, what the evidence suggests and so on. But I really did want to write a book that was accessible to people who wouldn't normally go for that kind of book, because I
Mhm.
think that her story is so important for people today to know, even if they don't count themselves as a history buff. And I think it's exceptionally important for anybody who is in church leadership, particularly in the Anglican Church or in any of the Reformed traditions for that matter, because I think it's really, really important for us in church leadership and in our pews to
Mhm.
understand the role of women in shaping the church that we have today. So that is kind of like my introductory
Sure.
remarks to answering
Yeah.
your question. I I have been fascinated by Anne Boleyn for most of my life. I vividly remember being introduced to her by my mother when I was quite young and watching Anne of the Thousand Days, which is a pretty
Mm.
iconic film about Anne Boleyn. Um, and and then just constantly kind of coming back to her throughout my life. I remember writing a paper in undergrad when I was studying music history, a
Mm.
paper on a piece of music that is attributed
Really?
to
Okay.
her. Most historians don't totally believe she really wrote it, but it's attributed to her.
Sure.
Um, and then I would say, in a very particular way, I think I was just always haunted by her in a
Mm.
pretty literal way, but also in a more figurative way. There's her story is so seemingly dramatic that no matter how good any one representation of her is in any of the pop culture offerings, it always left me wondering what questions weren't being answered, because
Mm.
there's so much in her story that demands explanation about why King Henry VIII decided he was going to marry her, why um, there was this complete upheaval of the religious and political fabric of England in order for that marriage to take place, and then why
Mhm.
3 years after that marriage took place, he had her killed. Um,
Yeah.
and So it was when I was just starting seminary. Um, and I found myself gravitating to the Trinity College Library in my spare time. You know, we have so much spare time as
Of course.
seminarians
Exactly.
to read Tudor history and particularly to read about Anne Boleyn.
Hmm.
Um, and I really attribute it to a gut instinct, maybe a leading of the spirit,
Hmm.
because what I discovered in those history books was extremely affirming for me as a young woman in seminary to
Sure.
realize that this woman who had always intrigued me had such a powerful hand in not just causing the English Reformation, but shaping it and
Sure.
shaping the church that we have today. So over the years, you've probably done this as well. You know, occasionally we teach Anglicanism 101
Hmm. Hmm.
classes for people who are new to our tradition or people who just have been part of our tradition for
Sure.
a long time
Yep.
but haven't really thought about things. And I will always, in one of those classes, say, you know, we have this sheepish backstory as Anglicans that our church was created by King Henry VIII wanting a
Yeah.
divorce. It's like not the most flattering backstory. And I will say to the people in the class, you know, the real truth is that the Anglican Church was created because the woman that King Henry VIII was interested in was a reformer.
Hmm.
And that's a really different spin on the narrative.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like almost to a person, with rare exception, that is greeted with tremendous surprise. Like people don't know that part of our history. They don't know that the fingerprints of Anne Boleyn are smudged all across the Anglican church that we have today in pretty remarkable ways. Um, and I think that needs to be corrected.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And we'll get into a little bit of kind of how she shaped that and what she did, because some of that stuff was new to me. But you also, part of your book is also um, talking about how she is misunderstood in kind of dramatic ways. And
Mm,
you talk about how um, in our modern time and current culture that there seems to be this love of Anne Boleyn. She kind of pops up in musicals and in the Hogwarts on the wall in Harry
yeah.
Potter, right? And so like kind of modern day has this love for Anne Boleyn, but misunderstand her dramatically. So
Hmm.
what are kind of those big ways that Anne Boleyn has historically been treated and misunderstood and misrepresented?
Yeah, so it's interesting, you know, the number of times over the course of writing this book that I would tell someone that I was writing this book on Anne Boleyn, and they would either, you know, not know that much about Anne Boleyn and be interested in hearing a bit more, but the number of times that someone did have a little bit of an inkling of who she was, that I got some kind of response to the tune of, well, you know, she tried to
Hmm.
land the king. You know, she put herself in the sights of the king. Um, and you know, these are like quite progressive, even feminist people who would say this to me. Um, and the implications of those statements kind of get at the heart of, I would say, the key ways that Anne Boleyn has been misrepresented over the course of history. And, you know, the, it's a loaded question. We could talk probably for hours about all of the misrepresentations, but fundamentally, she has been portrayed as a seductress, a manipulator, someone who tried to climb beyond her station, um, someone who, uh, you know, used the king's interest in her
Hmm.
and her feminine wiles and her sexual
Sure.
prowess to get herself made queen of England. Um, and then the subtle sort of unspoken part of that statement is that therefore she got what she deserved
Hmm.
when she fell from power so violently. And then, you know, kind of layered onto all of that, are a whole bunch of other tropes that are so easy to apply to women that say too much, that
Hmm.
want too much, that are too strong, that are too outspoken, labels like whore and
Hmm.
prostitute and witch. That's why she's on the wall of the Hogwarts
Hogwarts.
castle in the Harry Potter movies, is because um, these rumors of nefarious dark dealings and witchcraft also became
Mhm.
attached to her. And none of I think all of those labels deserve to be interrogated, even when they're being applied in a way that people um, find empowering. Some people have found it very empowering to imagine that uh, she just put King Henry VIII on the back foot, and she,
Sure.
kind of played him for a fool. That has had a certain appeal to it as well, but it's probably not an accurate representation of the actual dynamic between the King of England and
Sure.
this woman who he decided he was going to have at all costs.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, there's parts of her story, like I said, I didn't know, and that I was reading about, and in the way that she's been represented, and and particularly around the witchcraft thing, because like I would read some of the stuff as you were talking about it and thinking, like, come on. This seems fantastical that she has 6 fingers or 6 toes, so she's a witch. Like
Yeah.
that sounds like it's ripped from fairy tale, representations. But as you quoted, like historical texts and all these kind of these and scholars who said this is what it was. These are the people who talked about her and discredited her in terms of her role within England, and particularly in her role in establishing what we know now as the Anglican Church. It seemed, in some sense, it's horrifying that that's what happened within our own history.
Hmm.
That is part of the story that is what we need to kind of wrestle with in terms of um, who she was, how she changed history, her reputation. So,
Yeah, I think that as I note in the book, her story has loaned itself well to various fairy tale type treatments.
mhm,
Um, the idea that if a woman um, gets to marry the king or the prince, then she lives happily ever after.
sure,
The obviously she didn't live happily ever after, but
yeah,
at the heart of that narrative is this idea um, that of course gaining the attention of someone wearing the crown is the highest pinnacle that a woman could possibly reach. That of
sure,
course that's what she wants. Yeah, the witchcraft rumors and imagery that eventually got attached to her. It wasn't attached to her during her lifetime.
mhm,
There's no suggestion that she was accused of witchcraft during her lifetime. But all of those uh, tropes that got layered onto her later were really an argument against her as a reformer.
mhm,
And over the years, that core trouble that people had with her, that she had, religious views that a lot of people disagreed with. Being a reformer was a very
sure,
polarizing position and
yeah, yeah,
dangerous position to take in those days. That has kind of been relegated to the cutting room floor, and that has been left is like these salacious ideas
yeah,
of 6 fingers and third nipples
sure,
and
sure,
potions that she was mixing up to bewitch the king.
yeah, 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 absolutely. So we don't want to swing the other way in terms of that Anne was just this kind of demure, innocent flower that, you open the book by talking about this musical that you went to, which kind of presented Anne in a certain way, and you talk about how and I love the scene in it where you talk about how you wanted to scream about Anne's books, but her book. So talk to me about that in terms of, reacting against this. But Anne is also, she was just a ditzy, this kind of person who was swept away by the king.
Yeah, so the musical was six, and it's been an extremely popular, well-received musical. And, I have done like some digging on that musical, and certainly the creators know that Anne Boleyn was not a ditz and was not a gold digger and was not somebody who was just mindlessly sleeping with a whole bunch of people
Sure.
because she didn't know better, which is
Yeah.
kind of like they're presenting that in an ironic way, but I'm not sure that irony would be completely received by everybody in the audience because it plays into all of the things that people think that they know about Anne,
Yeah.
which was that she was kind of a bad woman who did some bad things. Um, so yeah, I that was there was a conversation with my brother around seeing the musical that kind of sparked my interest in writing this book. Um, but yeah, like I think what gets so easily lost in not just a fun musical, but in most of the most of the popular
Hmm.
representations of Anne's life is that she was an extremely well-educated woman who loved books, who was very well read, and what people really wanted to read at the turn of the 16th century was they wanted to read the Bible. Like
Hmm.
that was the bestseller status of the Bible got started in the 16th century. Like as soon as the printing press realized that there was money to be
Yeah.
made, that there was a capitalist venture attached to the printing press, what they most were feeding people's appetite for was access to the Bible, because
Hmm.
prior to the 16th century, the Bible had been accessed only through being able to read Latin,
Hmm.
and therefore really limited to a very elite group of people who could read Latin and who could access these manuscripts and then interpret them for others. So yeah, Anne was a book lover. She was a reader. She had access to the scriptures in French and other reformist ideas when she was raised in the court of
Hmm.
Queen Claude of France through her teenage years. And when she came back to England, she brought with her that love of reading, that desire to access not just the scriptures, but some
Hmm.
of those cutting edge reformers and thinkers who were beginning to circulate their material across Europe, often at their own peril, because again, those reform ideas, as popular as they became in certain areas, were very polarizing.
Yeah. So so your tagline, reputation, revolution, religion, and the queen who changed history. So in terms of combating the narrative of the Anglican Church was created because Henry wanted a divorce, and even if people know that that's not the case, generally speaking, they lock they talk about the history of the Anglican Church, generally speaking, to the men. Well, Henry was a reformer, or well, it's really due to Cranmer
Mm-hmm.
that happened. Um, and so if somebody came to you to say, okay, so what did Anne do? So how did she um, influence this change of history? How did she influence the reform of the church?
Yeah. Um, so it's historian McCullough who Diarmid McCullough, who calls her an architect of the Reformation. And I love that word for describing her influence rather than a catalyst, rather than
Hmm.
just kind of the spark that got things
Sure.
going. Because if you look at how she spent those years of waiting for the promised marriage to be made
Hmm.
Queen of England, to marry Henry, um, and for the split from Rome to happen, you can see how effective she was at putting in place the things that would make the English Reformation last, even beyond her early demise. So, you know, not to get like totally into the weeds, but to just identify a few of the
Yeah.
key parts that were so important in what she was doing over the course of those years. So first of all, she was making it possible for reform ideas to be heard and to be considered in a whole new way. So prior to her, reformers were living in exile. They were living
Mhm.
in the closet. Their lives were in danger. Their books were burned. And suddenly, if Anne was reading one of these books, then Henry thought that was a-okay. And so she was passing along to him materials, reformist materials that had previously being banned
Mhm.
or closeted, up to and including a really important tract by William Tyndale
Mhm.
that argued against the authority of the Pope and that centralized religious authority. So she was the one with her reading material who changed the conversation from um, trying to convince the Pope to grant Henry an annulment, which was the original
Yeah.
project. She shifted it from that to calling into question whether the Pope should have any authority in
Mm.
Henry's marriage at all or the religious affairs
Yeah.
of England. And from that point on, when that became the new focus, then Anne was the one who was essentially headhunting the talent to stack the decks
Mhm.
um, with reformers, to get
Sure.
reformers into the highest offices of the Church of England. And it was Anne who identified Thomas Cranmer as a rising star. It was Anne who identified Matthew Parker as a rising star. Well, Thomas Cranmer and Matthew Parker are two of the three theologians who would ultimately be credited with developing a distinctive Anglican thought. And
Mhm.
two of those three people were Anne Boleyn proteges that
Mm.
she moved into positions of power. When Thomas Cranmer was granted the Archbishop of Canterbury, was made the Archbishop of Canterbury, he went to thank King Henry VIII for the appointment. And Henry said, "You should thank Anne. It was her."
Yeah.
So that was kind of the big thing was personnel, was just how good of a politician she was, how good she was at identifying power, how good she was at negotiating the people that she identified into
Sure.
positions that would assure the continuation of reform, um, no matter what happened to her. And the other thing that she was really involved in doing. And again, this is very much tied to her books, to her reading material, to the things that she was most passionate about. And that was normalizing access to the Bible in English. And in 1535, so just the year before she died, there was a first um, printed English Bible, and uh, and it was dedicated to her and to King Henry. Um,
Mm.
so that was a pretty remarkable achievement in just a few years to go from like let's throw all of these Bibles in the public square and burn them for being not in Latin to um, to being able to secure and normalize reform principles to the point that an English Bible could be printed and
Sure.
that Henry would think that that was a good thing to have his name attached to it.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I appreciate about your book, and I'm going to read a little bit of a passage here, um, because I'm sure that there can be a tendency um, when we're dealing really with anybody, but with Anne Boleyn, to um, in some sense baptize her as this perfect kind of person, right? And one of the things that you write here is that you write, I want the jagged edges. I want the bits that don't sit well. I want the complexity and the color and the imperfections. I want the whole picture of Anne. Um, because Anne seemed to be this kind of complex person. Um, you talk at one point of how like she enjoyed watching animals fight. Like, and so um I guess when we look at Anne, one of the question is like, so is Anne, is she a role model to follow, or is she kind of a cautionary tale, or is she both?
Yeah, I don't think she's a cautionary tale. Um, I think that we want to be really clear that her husband killed her,
Yeah,
like, and she did not deserve that. There was nothing about her or what she did or what she said or how she behaved that warranted being killed. Um, there just wasn't. And it's very clear that the accusations of adultery were falsified, that
hmm,
she did not commit adultery with five men, including her brother. Um, and, historians today can go through the records of when and where she was supposed to have committed these adulterous acts and can rule out 75% of the accusations from 500 years later just based on knowing where the court was at various times and that she wasn't in the places
sure.
where she was said to have been, right? So the she's not a cautionary tale.
No,
She didn't deserve to die. um but I was really intentional about including some of the parts, like, liking to
yeah,
watch roosters fight to the death. Times when she was kind of shouting at people and arguing and argumentative. I included those parts. Other historians would dispute that, maybe not all of those accounts are from completely reliable narrators. Like maybe she wasn't, maybe she didn't.
sure.
We do have to question people's agendas when they're reporting these various things about Anne Boleyn. But I was really intentional about including them anyway because I didn't want to present Anne as a saint. I didn't want
Hmm,
to present her as this whitewashed
yeah.
version of somebody that we should put on a pedestal and then maybe not think about again. I wanted someone who was relatable. I wanted
Yeah.
um, and all of the kind of strong-willed argumentative sides of Anne I find kind of inspiring. Like I like to have women in our narratives who draw outside the lines, who don't completely behave in the way that we think they should, who speak up and speak out. I think that those are really positive qualities for us to celebrate in women as well.
Hmm,
So yeah, I like all of the not nice parts. There were as much as there were lots of people slandering Anne in her own time and beyond. There were others, of course, who were quite intent um, in turning her into a sort of saint, because there were lots of people who supported her reform principles and were glad and grateful for what she accomplished and what she accomplished for them. And so, especially in the time of her daughter Elizabeth, there were some really interesting pieces written that essentially turned her into a
hmm,
martyr of the Reformation.
sure.
Um, and, those ultimately haven't stood the test of time either, because they so clearly have some parts missing,
Hmm,
the more fiery aspects
yeah.
of Anne Boleyn's personality. So, do I think that she's a role model? Yeah, like I really do. I think she's perfect? No. Do I want her to be perfect? No, but yeah, is she a role model of someone um, who had really great ideas, deeply held principles, um, put herself on the line to advocate for things that were dangerous and polarizing, who um, you know didn't didn't shy away from putting the pedal to the metal on um, aligning herself with things that lots of people disagreed with. She did all of those things, and I find that enormously inspiring.
Mhm. So beyond, absolutely, and even as I would say, like, um, I would find that inspiring as well, and I think that does, um, kind of, I would say, push. I would hope all, particularly like, I would say, men and Anglican clergy, also people who kind of sit in that seat of power, to also think about, okay, so, where is God moving outside me? Right? Like, and maybe on what I might consider the fringes.
Hmm.
But where is God moving, and where do I need to pay attention to, um, how God is moving in other people. I often think about that in terms of my own wife, but also like in the women in the parish, but also in other marginalized groups, and how we kind of so often push people off to the side
Hmm.
and say, well, God's going to work with this centralized group here, and if God's going to speak, it's to us because we are the men, or we have the collar, or whatever it is. And maybe what actually God does to change the church, to change history, to change people, is God uses the people on the outside to draw attention to what needs to be changed.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I mean, that certainly is the arc of scripture, right? Like,
Yeah,
there aren't a lot of insiders who
no,
who are featured prominently in scripture. It
yeah,
is
yeah.
people on the margins, it's the unexpected people, it's the ones that you're not expecting.
Hmm.
Um, so I don't know why we would think that 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 MO of God's has shifted. Like, God's pretty clear that's who
Yeah.
God works through. Um, and yeah, I was really, really interested not just in Anne Boleyn's story and writing this book. And there were lots of parts of the book that ultimately got chopped.
Sure.
Uh, but I was really interested in the parallels between her story and other ways in which people that we haven't noticed or
Hmm.
haven't talked about or haven't featured in our understanding of who has shaped the church, that they've always been there. And
Hmm.
um, and that's what I think is like such an important shift in our thinking. I think that there's been this very colonialistic sort of view that, we who are in the center of power and who wear the collars and have a platform that we, need to give voice to the voiceless.
Hmm.
They have voices.
Sure.
They've
Yeah.
always been using them. They've always been
Yeah.
using them, and their voices and their ideas and their choices and their contributions have always shaped the church. Always.
Hmm.
Um, we just haven't noticed or talked about it or given credit. We
Yeah.
haven't paid attention, right? So um, it's and for me as a woman, that's really important. It's really important for me to think, okay, well, yeah, I'm part of this year in the Anglican Church of Canada. We celebrate the 50th
Hmm.
anniversary of the ordination of women. And 50 years, that's great. It's not a long time in the course of a
No. Yeah.
2000-year history. But how much differently do we look at that history, and do we look at the ordination of women, leadership of women in our churches, the appointment of the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Sarah Mullally,
Hmm.
when we frame that not as a brand new thing that we started 50 years ago, but as a continuation of what has always been happening. Women have
Yeah,
always been leading and shaping our churches. We just haven't wanted to give it legitimacy.
sure. Yeah. And we haven't been listening.
Haven't
Absolutely.
been listening.
Yeah, definitely. You reminded me of one question I wanted to ask, um, because I knew, but having gone through the process myself, I know that whenever you publish a book, the editing process is always it's painful. There are always, there are scenes and chapters and portions um, that, oh, I love this, but it just doesn't fit,
Mm.
or I have to take it out and for the unity of the book. Is there any kind of either discussion or a part of Anne or a snippet that you would have loved to include in the book that just didn't fit that you would in your presentations? I know that you're talking a lot about Anne as you go along, that you are also wanting to bring forward. Um,
Yeah, I would say that the parts that got cut that were hard to let go of were more about the the parallels. So the
hmm,
parallels that I see between myself and Anne Boleyn, the parallels that I see between Anne Boleyn and other stories and voices that haven't been paid enough
yeah.
attention to. Um, there was a whole section that I had, I'm sure it got cut. Um, and it was from some research that I did uh, by someone who wrote a book called God's Ghostwriters, talking
Mm,
about the imprint of enslaved women on writing the Bible. Because, like, prior to the printing press, Bibles had to be written out by hand. And
sure.
that labor would have been primarily assigned to enslaved people and often
Hmm.
women, that there
Sure.
would have been women specifically educated to be literate enough to be able to copy out these manuscripts because, of course, someone of wealth and prestige was not going
Sure.
to
Not going to do
that
that. Sure.
very onerous labor themselves. And that you can see across all of the little variations of the manuscripts that we have, those earliest manuscripts that we have, the ways in which the people copying out those manuscripts inserted themselves
Yeah.
and inserted they were co-authors of what became sacred scripture. I just found that like so illuminating to
Sure.
imagine. And like, have you ever heard anybody say that? Like, uh,
No, not that, not the God's ghostwriters. No, I've never heard that before.
yeah, and
Um,
like the idea that
yeah,
enslaved people and enslaved women um sort of got their
yeah,
voice onto what became our sacred scriptures. I love that
yeah.
idea.
I know that a professor of mine, the year after I graduated, started, I believe, doing a course. Um, call about women interpreters of the Bible, which was
Mm,
all about throughout history of how women were, whether they were recognized as leaders in the church or not, but they were always interpreting scripture and preaching the scriptures and all that stuff, and how that has continually been a part of the history of the church.
yeah.
But whenever we think about, who were the scholars of the Bible, it's the Luther, the Calvins, it's, it's all the men. But women were there too,
Hmm.
often providing um, amazing and brilliant interpretations and understandings of what the scripture spoke to in their time and in their context, and in terms of just humanity and the world that in which we face.
Yeah, well, that is exactly in line with, I think, um what I find so important for us to be clarifying, you know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. So if somebody, and I literally had this conversation the other day when I was talking to someone and who mentioned, you're Anglican, right? And so Anglicanism because Henry wanted a divorce, right? Like, and luckily I had read your book, so you know, so I knew that that was the case, and I knew kind of how to respond. But like, so if somebody says that to you, you know, how do you respond?
Yeah, so I mean that is my standard response, which I will always follow up with climbing onto my soapbox if invited to do so, which is to
Sure,
say
yeah.
King Henry VIII, our church was not created because Henry VIII wanted a divorce. It was created because the woman that he was interested in was a reformer. I mean, she shaped the direction and um, the content of that
Hmm.
reform from the outset. And again, once invited to do so, I'm happy to talk about the appointments and the personnel and the politics and the headhunting and the fundamental. I think it's fair to call and an evangelical. So that is kind of the umbrella term of the time.
Hmm.
There were a lot of different versions of reform, but at the core, Anne was definitely an evangelical, which means that centering access to the scripture and the ability to read the scriptures and then base uh, your decisions and the structure of the church around the authority of God's word. That was really central for her. So yeah, depending on how big people's appetite is for hearing all of that, I
Sure.
kind of like measure my response accordingly. But
Yeah, yeah.
but I really would love for it to become common knowledge, especially in our church, that uh, that Anne Boleyn was such a formidable influence on the church that we have. And it's really interesting, I talk about this in the book. Like, there certainly is not by any means a straight line between like
Sure.
Anne's vision right out of her head onto the church that we have today. Um, the reform in England took a very convoluted, messy course with a lot of ups and downs and backs and
Yeah.
forths and so on. But it is really interesting that the faith that Anne was familiar with, this kind of reforming Catholic sort of faith. She continued to participate in the sacraments of the church right up until right before her death. She was not a baby out with the bathwater kind of
Sure.
reformer, as far as we can tell. She was very much in line with the reformers that she was formed by on the continent, people like Marguerite d'Angoulême. Um, that reforming Catholic sort of uh, um, color to her faith is sort of what we ended up with in Anglicanism as the middle way, like.
Hmm.
And again, there were a lot of babies thrown out with bathwaters at various
Sure.
times in the Anglican Church, but isn't it interesting that that is um, sort of what we like? That's the Anglicanism that we recognize today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's great. I think it's and I definitely can see kind of the through line of of Anne who, you know, was was queen, so in some sense part of kind of a ruling class, but also not, right? And so, and yet God was not working through the Hall of Power, but through kind of the side, right? And so how the church as we have it, you know, is you know, is to be not is hierarchical, and so, like we are hierarchical, we have bishops,
Hmm.
priests, and all that stuff, but it's also synodically led. Like it's
Hmm.
also about everybody, right? Um and I think I wonder just how, like for me, how reading the book. reminds me, and the story of Anne reminds me that synodically, that like us all is together, that God works um, through everyone and through other people is an important understanding for how we do church. And
Yeah.
that, you know, that it's not just about the people at the head table, right?
Yeah.
And once you get to the head table, then you're okay and you just keep your power, right? In some sense, Henry shows us that that's not the way to do things, right? So, um, I think that there's just a fabulous kind of just, I think, call to remember that as part of just as Anglicans, the DNA of who we are to be.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting insight and, related to that, and I haven't mentioned this yet, but again, so much of that reforming Catholic influence on Anne Boleyn was very connected to the emerging humanism and
Hmm.
to this very practical approach to reform that, again, those female influences on Anne really leaned towards, which was that following Jesus involved some economic reordering of society. And and again, we can kind of see in some pretty consequential ways and standing up for um, for that uh, that economic reordering, um, that was baked into her vision of what reform was going to be. It ultimately clashed with other people who were in power, but
Hmm.
again, isn't it interesting? I think the Anglican Church today, at its best, um, certainly understands Jesus' call as having a very uh, particular responsibility to care for the marginalized and to advocate for systemic change in our world.
Hmm. Absolutely. So so you call this year the year of Anne Boleyn.
Yeah, the year
So
of Boleyn.
the year of
That's
Boleyn. Yeah. So
that's my
so
hashtag.
yeah, absolutely. So what are, and I know that you're going to be doing probably other podcasts and stuff. So if people want to kind of follow you, to know you, or to kind of join what you're doing in the coming kind of months, what's ahead for you?
Yeah, well, you can definitely follow me on social media, Instagram. You can find me on Facebook. I have some really dear friends who are lovely with social media, so they're really helping me to put some of this content out on social media in some interesting ways. I do have a number of uh, podcasts lined up. I'm kind of on a podcast tour. I
Great.
have some in-person speaking engagements set up. I hope that I'll have some more opportunities because, again, I really do have a particular desire for Anglicans
Hmm.
to hear this hidden history of ours, um, and to feel really confident knowing that women have had such a formidable influence on shaping our church. So I imagine that those will come along. I do have a couple of events tied to the 50th
Oh,
anniversary of
good.
the ordination of
Yeah.
women. Um, so that's kind of cool to have my book coming out in the
Yeah.
year when that anniversary is taking place. Um, yeah, I I think that those are the main things to share in that respect. Oh, I have some op-eds that I'm writing and will come out in different places. Um, it's it's a real joy to have opportunities to talk about this because as you can tell, I'm sure from talking to me, I feel
Absolutely.
so personally invested in this
Yeah.
as a woman leader in the church.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I would say like, the book was, informative and inspirational to me. And I will say, as a male reader, I think that there is a lot, and I can see why Anne, as as a woman and as a priest in the Anglican Church, why this is really important for other women and stuff. I would say as men, it's really important for us to know as well,
Thank you for saying that.
right?
Yes,
Yeah, yeah,
I think that is so true,
yep,
I think that it doesn't matter what gender you are. I think that we are all not just enlightened in our history, but I think we're deepened in our faith by knowing that God works in such
absolutely.
a wide variety of ways
Yeah,
that thanks be to God, God hasn't just been limited to
no,
working through white
absolutely.
guys, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
so
and there's this, um, and everything that she represented is an inspiration in terms of, you know, of me and my parish and all that stuff about God working in the church and God working through people. And I just think that it's um yeah, I think I highly support, I think everybody should pick up your book. And because it is inspirational in terms of, I think, probably just our history, our Reformed history, but particularly our Anglican history.
mhm.
And to know it rightly and to understand what exactly took place, um, so that we can be open to the possibilities of what can take place going forward,
Yeah,
right?
I think that's right. And I appreciate that you led off by saying, like, this isn't a dry history book. It
No,
is meant to
no,
be
no.
very accessible. If history isn't your thing, please read it anyway, because,
Yeah,
yeah, it is like kind of a constant conversation between the history then and who we are now and why it matters.
yeah,
So I think people will find lots of different points of access in the book. And and find it pretty easy to digest in terms of the research.
yeah. Wonderful. Where can they pick it up? On Amazon, in bookstores?
Yep, you can get it. If you're Canadian, you can get it on Chapter's website. You can get it on Amazon. There are various local bookstores around that will be carrying it. So, you can always ask your local bookstore to order it in. Um, Local bookstores love that kind of thing and love your support. Hooray, local bookstores.
Yeah,
But yes, you can also easily get it through Chapters and Amazon.
wonderful. Martha, thank you for your time. It is always a pleasure to have a conversation with you, and I look forward to the time when we get to actually like have a coffee together.
Yeah, I feel like we should make that happen. I
We
mean, we
should.
are kind of at other, pretty far away from each other on
Yeah,
this continent, but I think we could make it happen.
we'll figure out a time. Yeah,
Okay.
wonderful.
Thank you
Okay,
so much, Kyle.
thank you very much.